January in 9th century England was not a season. It was a test. The days were short. The sun, when it appeared at all, hung low and pale over the hills of Wiltshire before sinking again by mid-afternoon. The nights were long and black and cold in a way that modern people cannot easily imagine, cold that crept through timber walls, cold that stiffened leather and cracked skin, cold that killed the old and the young without warning. But for the people of Wessex, winter was also something else. It was safety. No army marched in January. The roads turned to mud, rivers flooded, horses went lame, supplies rotted. Every warlord in Britain knew the same unwritten rule. You fight in summer and you survive in winter. That was how it had always been. And so, in the first week of January 878, the people of Chippenham, the royal estate of King Alfred of Wessex, did what people always did in winter. They sat by the fire. They drank ale, they told stories, they believed they were safe. They were wrong. What happened in the next 48 hours would bring the kingdom of Wessex to the edge of extinction, drive its king into the wilderness, and set in motion the most extraordinary survival story in English history. This is what Wessex looked like in 878, the winter that almost destroyed England. We are going to walk through Wessex in the dead of winter. First, we will see the royal estate at Chippenham as it stood in those last peaceful days, its timber halls, its smoky fires, its people wrapped in wool against the cold. Then we will feel the night that shattered everything, the Viking attack that broke every rule of war and turned the feast of Twelfth Night into a nightmare. And finally, we will follow King Alfred into the fog and mud of the Somerset marshes, where the last king of free England became a fugitive, a guerrilla, and eventually something greater than he had ever been before. To understand what happened in 878, you have to understand what Wessex was. By the 9th century, Wessex was the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still standing. The others had fallen one by one to the great heathen army, the enormous Viking force that had landed in East Anglia in 865 and swept across Britain like a flood. Northumbria had fallen in 867. Its kings were dead. East Anglia had been conquered in 869. Its king, Edmund, was executed, tied to a tree, and killed by arrows, according to the later accounts. Mercia, the great kingdom of central England, had crumbled. Its king had fled across the sea, and a Viking puppet sat on his throne. Only Wessex remained. Wessex stretched across the south of England from the marshes of Somerset in the west to the borders of Kent in the east. Its heartland was the chalk downland of Wiltshire, Hampshire and Dorset, rolling hills, broad valleys, thick forests of oak and ash, and rivers that fed rich farmland. It was not a wealthy kingdom by continental standards. There were no great stone cities, no Roman-style palaces. The towns were small, the churches were modest, the roads were the old Roman ones, crumbling but still passable. But Wessex had something the other kingdoms had lacked: Alfred. Alfred had become king in 871 at the age of about 22, in the middle of a war. His brother, King Ethelred, had died after a year of brutal fighting against the Vikings, and Alfred had inherited a kingdom that was already bleeding. In his first year as king, Alfred fought at least 9 battles against the Danes. He won some, he lost others. Eventually, he bought peace, paying the Vikings to leave, a common practice at the time, though one that only ever delayed the problem. For the next 5 years, Wessex had an uneasy truce. The Vikings turned their attention to Mercia and Northumbria. Alfred used the time to strengthen his defences, build alliances, and prepare for the attack he knew would come again. By January 1878, Alfred was 28 years old. He had been king for 7 years. He was experienced, determined, and deeply religious. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was about to happen. Chippenham sat on a bend of the River Avon in Wiltshire. It was a royal estate, a villa regia, not a town in any modern sense, but a collection of buildings centred around the King's Great Hall, where Alfred held court, dispensed justice, and hosted the feasts that bound his noblemen to his service. The hall itself was the largest structure in Chippenham, built of heavy oak timbers with thick walls and a steeply pitched roof thatched with rye straw. It would have been perhaps 60 or 70 feet long and 25 feet wide. Inside, the space was dominated by a central hearth, a long fire pit where logs burned day and night through the winter months. The smoke from that fire had no chimney to escape through. It rose and gathered under the thatch, blackening the rafters, filling the upper air with a permanent grey haze. Your eyes stung. Your clothes smelled of wood smoke for days. But the fire was life. Without it, the hall was a tomb. Along the walls, wooden benches doubled as beds, tapestries and animal hides hung from pegs to keep out draughts. The floor was packed earth covered in rushes that were changed when they became too filthy, which, in winter, was often. Around the great hall, smaller buildings clustered in a loose compound, a kitchen separate from the hall to reduce the risk of fire, a bakehouse where bread was made daily, heavy, dark loaves of barley and rye, nothing like the wheat bread that would come later, storerooms for salted meat, dried fish, barrels of ale and sacks of grain, a small timber church where Alfred heard mass each morning, stables for the horses, workshops where smiths repaired weapons and tools. Beyond these buildings, the estate spread out into farmland. Fields lay fallow under the frost, their stubble poking through thin snow. Cattle huddled in sheltered enclosures, their breath steaming in the cold air. Sheep grazed on whatever dead grass they could find. Pigs rooted in the edges of the woodland. The people of Chippenham lived close to the land and close to each other. In a royal estate, the household included the king's personal retinue, his thanes, his warriors, their families, along with servants, cooks, grooms, smiths, and the priests who served the church. In winter, visiting nobles and their followers swelled the numbers further, arriving for the Christmas feasting season that stretched from late December through Twelfth Night on the 6th of January. Winter life followed a rhythm dictated by daylight and cold. The day began before dawn, in darkness. The church bell rang for the first prayers. Then came the slow business of rekindling fires, fetching water from the river, feeding animals, and preparing the first meal, usually a porridge of oats or barley, thickened with whatever was to hand. The short daylight hours were spent on maintenance, repairing tools, mending fences, tending livestock, cutting and hauling firewood, an endless task, because the fires in the hall and the kitchen consumed enormous quantities of wood, and letting them go out was not an option. Women spun wool and wove cloth. They brewed ale, a task that took days and was vital, because ale was the main drink for everyone, from the king to the lowest servant. Water was unreliable. Ale was safe, warming, and nourishing. A household the size of Chippenham's would have consumed staggering quantities of it. By mid-afternoon, the light was already failing. The second and main meal of the day was served in the great hall. In the depths of winter, this was the centre of everything. The fire blazing, tallow candles and rushlights casting a flickering, smoky glow. The smell of roasting meat, of ale, of damp wool drying by the flames. The food was heavy and preserved. salted pork, smoked fish, hard cheese, root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, onions, boiled into thick stews, bread, always bread, torn and dipped into the broth. On feast days there was fresh killed meat roasted on spits over the fire, and mead, the honey wine that was reserved for special occasions. After the meal the hall became a social space. A scop, a poet, a storyteller might recite tales of old heroes and ancient battles. A harpist might play. Men drank and talked. Children fell asleep on the benches. Dogs fought over bones under the tables, and outside the night pressed in. Black and absolute. No streetlights, no lanterns along the road. If you stepped outside the hall, the darkness swallowed you. The only sounds were the wind, the river, and the occasional cry of an owl. This was Chippenham in the first days of January 878, a place of firelight and fellowship, a place where the cold was kept at bay by walls and flames and the warmth of other bodies, a place that felt, in those short winter days, like the safest place in the world. The 12th night feast was the last great celebration of the Christmas season. On the 6th of January, the hall would have been full. Alfred's thanes and their families, local churchmen, visiting nobles from across Wessex, the ale flowing, the fire roaring, stories told, oaths renewed. No one in that hall was thinking about war, and that was exactly what Guthrum was counting on. Guthrum was not a reckless raider, he was a strategist. He had been fighting in England for years. He knew the Anglo-Saxon way of war, the seasonal campaigns, the winter truces, the assumption that no army would move in January. He knew that Alfred's feared the militia of free men who formed the backbone of the West Saxon army would have been sent home for the winter. He knew that Chippenham was not fortified. He knew that the king would be there, surrounded by a small household guard, relaxed, unsuspecting. And he knew that if he could take Alfred, capture him, or kill him, Wessex would fall. There was no other leader, no other kingdom. Alfred was the last. The attack came in the days immediately after Twelfth Night. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records it with brutal simplicity. In this year, in midwinter after Twelfth Night, the enemy army came stealthily to Chippenham and occupied the land of the West Saxons and settled there, and drove a great part of the people across the sea, and conquered most of the others, and the people submitted to them, except King Alfred. Except King Alfred. Try to imagine it. The night after a feast. The hall quiet. Men sleeping off the ale, the fires burning low. Guards at the gate, perhaps, but tired, cold, and not expecting anything. And then movement in the darkness. The sound of horses, the clatter of weapons, shouts in a language that was not English, torches appearing between the trees, not one or two, but dozens coming from every direction. The Viking army had marched through the winter night, through the mud, through the cold, through conditions that every military tradition said made warfare impossible. They had moved in silence, in darkness, and they had reached Chippenham before anyone knew they were coming. The attack was not a pitched battle, it was a strike, fast, overwhelming, and deliberate. The Vikings poured into the estate. Buildings were set alight, the red glow of burning thatch against the white of the snow. The screams of people dragged from their beds, the clash of iron in the darkness. Alfred escaped. How exactly is not recorded in detail. The sources tell us only that the king fled with a small band of followers into the night. He may have been woken by a loyal guard, he may have heard the commotion and acted on instinct, he may have fought his way out through the chaos. What is certain is that Alfred did not stay to fight. He could not. The Vikings had numbers, surprise, and momentum. To stay was to die or be captured. And if Alfred died that night, Wessex died with him. So, he ran out of the hall into the freezing darkness, away from the fires and the screaming, into the open countryside of Wiltshire in January with nothing but the clothes on his back, a handful of followers, and the knowledge that everything he had built was burning behind him. The King of Wessex had become a fugitive. In the days that followed, Guthrum did exactly what he had planned. His army occupied Chippenham. They spread out across Wessex. They took the royal estates, the market towns, the river crossings. Much of the population submitted. Some fled across the sea to Francia. Others simply accepted Viking rule because the alternative was death. Wessex, the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom, appeared to be finished, and somewhere in the darkness of the Wiltshire countryside, a young king was walking through the snow, heading west, towards the only place in England where the Vikings could not follow. If this kind of reconstruction is something you value, subscribing to Walter Reconstructs History is the best way to make sure the next one happens. Every video takes weeks of research, writing, and production, and your subscription tells me that this work matters. If you have been watching this far, you already care about history done properly. That means a lot. Now, let us follow Alfred into the marshes. Alfred headed west, through Wiltshire into Somerset, towards the flat, wet country of the Somerset levels. This was not a retreat planned in advance, it was a desperate flight. The king and his small band of survivors, perhaps a few dozen men at most, moved through hostile territory, avoiding Viking patrols, sleeping in forests, eating whatever they could find. The winter countryside offered little. The fields were bare. The villages were either abandoned or under Viking control. But Alfred knew where he was going. The Somerset levels are a vast lowland plain stretching across central Somerset. In the 9th century, much of this landscape was marsh, not firm ground with puddles, but true wetland. Miles of reeds, sedge, and flooded channels broken by patches of alder woodland so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. In winter, the rivers burst their banks and the entire plain became a shallow inland sea, navigable only by those who knew the hidden paths and waterways. In the middle of this waterlogged wilderness stood Athelney, the Isle of the Princes. Athelney was not impressive to look at. It was a low rise of harder ground, barely 30 feet above the surrounding marsh at its highest point, perhaps half a mile long, 2 modest hills connected by a narrow ridge. In dry summer it was simply a bump in the landscape, but in winter, when the floods came, Athelney became an island, surrounded on all sides by water, mud, and impenetrable reed beds. This was where Alfred made his stand, not with an army, not behind stone walls, but in the mud, the fog, and the silence of a place that no Viking force could reach. The conditions were grim. There was no great hall here, no roaring fire, no benches, no tapestries, no ale flowing from barrels. Alfred and his followers lived like outlaws, and, in a real sense, they were. They built rough shelters from timber, branches and reeds. They caught fish from the channels and rivers that wound through the marshland. They hunted wildfowl, ducks, geese, herons in the reed beds. They foraged for whatever the winter marsh could provide. The cold was relentless. The ground was always wet, clothes never fully dried, leather rotted, iron rusted. The fog rolled in from the flooded levels and hung in the air for days, turning the world into a grey, featureless blank, where direction itself became uncertain. For a man who had been a king, who had sat in a great hall, worn fine wool, eaten from silver, and commanded the loyalty of thousands, this was a humiliation beyond anything Alfred had ever experienced. The King of Wessex was hiding in a swamp, eating fish cooked over a smoking fire, surrounded by a handful of men who had nowhere else to go. And it was here, in this lowest moment, that the most famous legend about Alfred was born, the story of the cakes. According to the tale, which appears in later sources and may or may not contain a grain of truth, Alfred took shelter in the home of a swineherd's wife. The woman, not knowing who he was, left him to watch her cakes baking by the fire while she went about her work. Alfred, lost in thought, consumed by the weight of his kingdom's collapse, let the cakes burn. The woman returned and scolded him furiously. The King of England reduced to being shouted at by a peasant woman for burning bread. Whether the story is true does not matter. What matters is what it tells us about how far Alfred had fallen and how far he would have to climb to get back. But Alfred did not break. This is the part of the story that separates Alfred from every other Anglo-Saxon king. Others had lost battles, others had been driven from their thrones. They fled abroad, or they surrendered, or they died. Alfred did none of these things. He sat in the mud of Athelney, and he planned. From the marshes, Alfred began to wage a guerrilla campaign. He sent messengers to the ealdormen, the regional leaders of Wessex, who had not submitted to Guthrum. He raided Viking supply lines. He ambushed foraging parties. He kept the resistance alive, not through grand battles, but through persistence, through the sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And Wessex listened. It is important to understand that Alfred had not lost everyone. The Viking occupation was brutal but incomplete. Guthrum controlled the towns and the roads, but the countryside, the forests, the farms, the isolated villages was still largely Saxon. The people of Wessex had submitted out of necessity, not loyalty. They were waiting for someone to tell them it was time to fight. While Alfred held out in Athelney, news arrived from Devon that changed everything. A separate Viking force, led by the warrior Ubba, brother of Ivar the Boneless, one of the most feared names in the Viking world, had sailed from Wales with 23 ships and landed on the Devon coast. Ubba carried with him the legendary Raven banner, said to have been woven by the daughters of Ragnar Lothbrok and believed by the Vikings to guarantee victory. But Ealdorman Odda of Devon did not wait to be besieged. He gathered his men, farmers mostly, not professional soldiers, and attacked the Viking camp at dawn. In the battle that followed, Ubba was killed. Over 800 of his men fell with him. The Raven banner was captured. The Battle of Sinwit was not a large engagement by later standards, but its psychological impact was enormous. One of the great Viking leaders was dead. The magical banner was gone. And in the marshes of Somerset, Alfred heard the news and knew that the tide was turning. In May of 878, Alfred rode out of Athelney. He sent word across Wessex. Ride to Egbert's Stone, bring your weapons, bring your men. The king is alive. The king is fighting. And they came. From Somerset, from Wiltshire, from Hampshire. The feared assembled, the free men of Wessex, farmers and craftsmen who owed military service to their king. They came on foot and on horseback, carrying swords and spears and shields, and when they saw Alfred, alive, standing before them, the king they had been told was finished, they wept with joy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the scene with quiet power, and he was received with great rejoicing. From Egbertstone, Alfred marched his army to Eddington on the edge of Salisbury Plain, where Guthrum's forces waited. The Battle of Eddington was fought in the old Saxon way, two shield walls facing each other across an open field, men pressed shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, pushing and stabbing and dying in a grinding, exhausting contest of endurance and will. Alfred's men held. And then they pushed. And then the Viking line broke. Guthrum's army fled to their camp and Alfred pursued. He besieged them for 14 days. Starving and surrounded, Guthrum surrendered. The terms were extraordinary. Guthrum would be baptized as a Christian. Alfred would stand as his godfather. Guthrum would take his army and leave Wessex forever. The two kingdoms would be divided by a boundary, the Danelaw to the north and east, Wessex and its allies to the south and west. The ceremony took place at Aller, near Athelney, within sight of the marshes where Alfred had hidden just weeks before. Guthrum knelt in the water and emerged as Athelstan, his Christian name. Alfred lifted him from the font. The man who had destroyed Chippenham had been defeated by the man who had survived it. Wessex in 878 was not a kingdom saved by a grand battle. It was a kingdom saved by a man who refused to die in the cold. When Guthrum struck at Chippenham, he did everything right. He chose the moment. He broke the rules. He caught his enemy unprepared. By every measure of 9th century warfare, he should have won. Wessex should have fallen as Northumbria fell, as East Anglia fell, as Mercia fell. England should have become a Viking country, and the language you are listening to now might never have existed. But Alfred survived the night. He walked into the snow, he found the marshes, and from the worst place imaginable, cold, wet, hungry, stripped of everything a king is supposed to have, he rebuilt. Not because he was invincible, not because he had a secret army waiting, but because he would not stop, because the people of Wessex, battered and frightened as they were, had not given up either. Because when the word came that the king was alive and fighting, they picked up their weapons and walked through the mud to find him. That is the story of Wessex in 878. Not a story of glory, a story of endurance, a story of what happens when everything falls apart and one person decides that it will not end here. Not tonight, not in the cold. Wessex did not die in the snow. And England was born in the marshes. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this kind of deep historical reconstruction, please subscribe to Walter Reconstructs History. I make videos that bring lost kingdoms, decisive moments, and great turning points back to life in a way that is simple, visual, and grounded in real history. And if there is another lost city, forgotten battle, or vanished world you want to see rebuilt, leave it in the comments. What should I reconstruct next on Walter Reconstructs History?